see all of you again. So I'm here to talk about chaos, and I don't think you need me to tell you that the world is awash in it right now, sort of everywhere we look, right? From what's going on in Congress with the Speaker of the House, to what's going on between Israel and Hamas, or Ukraine, or even on a more fundamental basis, the things that are happening with AI. And when we look around our world, when we look to the future, it can be a little bit scary. And I think especially for a lot of you who are young and are trying to chart your future and make choices about what you're going to be, it can be frankly terrifying to have no idea what that future will look like. Like, for instance, do I know what the world will look like in 50 years? Do I know what the best job to have will be? I have no idea, and you probably don't either. So, my talk today is about basically how to navigate life given all the change we're undergoing and given that dramatic uncertainty. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about, first, the fact that historically speaking, this era of dramatic change really isn't new, which offers some comfort. I'm going to talk about how that era of change has impacted the way people think of themselves and identity, and then I'm going to talk about how to build a resilient sense of self in the face of all this change. So, first topic, I know I said that all this change isn't that new, but historically speaking, it is kind of new, because it really starts around 1750. Before, in the old times, things didn't change too much. So if you look at like the hunter-gatherer days, we have like 100,000 years where pretty much all people did was hunt and gather. And then we get agriculture, and we had another 12,000, 13,000 years or so where most people's lives in most of the world looked more or less the same. They were farmers. They ate more or less the same thing. They put a grain buried, in a pot, and then whatever else they happened to have for the day. So grain plus onion, or grain plus rabbit, grain plus pig, whatever. Their holidays were the same. They were all geared towards the agricultural calendar. So you had your harvest holidays, you had your winter slack season holidays, you had your planting festival holidays, and then you don't have very many holidays in the spring through fall because people are busy. That's most of history. Things are the same. But then the world starts to change dramatically and quickly around 1750, right? And the big change among many changes, as I'm sure you know, is the Industrial Revolution. And it brings with it a whole slew of changes, right? People go from mostly living in the countryside to mostly living in cities. People go from mostly doing the jobs their parents did to having a choice of many, many jobs. We get the birth of things like democracy. So people have choices in terms of politics. People have choices in terms of religion, etc., and so forth. And all of these changes are going to have a huge impact on the way people think of themselves, which is my second topic. Right? In the old days, people had what are called role-based identities. Right? And I'll give an example. There was a guy named Johannes Huss who was in charge of the Huss farm in Germany for 600 years. Now, clearly this wasn't one guy with a biblical lifespan or a really good fitness regime. There were a lot of Johannes Husses, and in fact, each Johannes would name his first 2 or 3 sons Johannes, just to be sure that always there was a Johannes Huss in charge of this farm. And if your name was Johannes Huss, you didn't have a lot of choices in life, right? You knew what you were going to do. You're going to run the farm. You knew you were going to live on the farm. You knew what your religion was, whatever the leader of your principality said it was, because that's how it worked. You knew what your politics were because there weren't any. You even knew pretty much who you were going to marry, because there were maybe 5 women who, in terms of suitability, in terms of are they going to bring the right connections to the farm, are they the right social class, do they live nearby, do they live in my family, there may be like 5 people to choose from, right? So more or less what you have is you're born into a role, and the question isn't, what will I be when I grow up? It's basically how well will I be what I know I will be when I grow up. And people could opt out, right? You could always go be a mercenary or join the merchant marine, but by and large, this is the way the world works. You were born into a role. Now, all those changes I talked about, the modernity, the Industrial Revolution, that changes that fundamentally. And if you look around the world today, if you look at your lives, right, as high school students, you're now faced with tons and tons of changes. Already, you have to choose things like, what will I study? Where will I apply to college? When I go to college, what will I major in? What will I do in my summers? When I get out of college, what job will I have? Where will I live? If I have a spouse, who will it be? You can even choose who to vote for. You can even choose your religion. And making all of these choices is hard enough, but it becomes even harder when we don't know exactly where the future's leading. And because the pace of change in the world keeps increasing, it gets increasingly hard to know where we're going. So in that context of having to make all these choices and making choices in a world of change, what can we do to make sure we get it right? Well, there's a couple things. First is the choice itself, right? How do we make a good choice? And for a lot of people, when they think about this, they think about it in terms of career, right? How do I choose a career that I know will work out in the long term? And I'm sure your parents are concerned with this, maybe even more so than you are, but it's probably on your minds a little bit. Now, my message on that is maybe the career isn't quite as important as we think it is, and I'll give an example of that. This comes from a psychological study I really like by a psychologist called Carolyn Showers. And she did a longitudinal study of women who moved for their career. So they moved cities in pursuit of a new job. And across the board, all of these women agreed that their new job was better, right? In most ways, right? Better pay, they liked the people they worked with, they found the work rewarding. But some of these women reported being very happy with the move, and some of the women reported being miserable, like they wished they hadn't done it. And when she looked into it, into why some were happy and some were miserable, what she found was it was largely an issue of identity. People who really defined themselves by their job were happy with the move. But people who maybe define themselves more by their family relations, or the place they're from, or their faith community, whatever it was, those people were not happy. Which leads me to my first point. When it comes to deciding where you want to be, where you want to stand in the world, the first thing you need to know is yourself and who you are so you can make the right choice. In America, we often just think the career will solve all our problems. The career will be the source of all happiness, right? The career will provide our social group, our money, it will give us access to the sort of neighborhood we want to live in, it will give us meaning, and for some people that's true, but not for everybody, so you need to know yourself. The second thing is, no matter where you decide to stand, no matter what career you choose, I guarantee you, at some point, you're probably going to have the rug pulled out from under your feet. Because I can tell you as an historian, it's really hard to predict how things are going to go and what field you need to be in. And often people get it wrong. And I'll give you 3 examples from the past to the present. So first example, you guys may be familiar with this from history class. Back in the late 1700s, they invented this awesome thing called the spinning jenny, which looks a lot like the spindle in Sleeping Beauty, for those of you who are familiar with that film. And the spinning jenny was great because it could spin thread way, way, way faster than people used to be able to do so. And then they invented a water-driven and a steam-driven spinning jenny, and now they could spin so much thread you just wouldn't believe it. They had thread coming out their ears, which meant they needed a lot of weavers. So the demand for weavers went sky high, the pay for weavers went through the roof, and weaving became a door to a middle-class standard of living. So all over England, people were becoming weavers, and they were doing very well. And then they invented the power loom, which took all the weavers' jobs, and that door to the middle class slammed shut. And that's a story that's just been told over and over again ever since then, right? So you think of the post-war era, 1950s, The US is basically the only functioning industrial economy in the world, so demand for US goods is high. Mechanization hasn't really taken off, and so it's a golden age for the American factory worker. Factory work becomes the gateway, the door to middle-class living, and then what happens? Mechanization, competition from the rest of the world takes off, and to a certain extent that door stands shut. For most of the last 200 years, white-collar jobs have been immune to these sorts of problems, right? You could always be a lawyer or a doctor or go into finance, and the machines hadn't gotten their way with that yet, only now. With the expansion of AI, a lot of those finance jobs are done by algorithms. A lot of these simple things lawyers do in terms of sort of formulaic forms can now be done just as well by ChatGPT. And so even the white-collar jobs are becoming more tenuous. And this, I hope, is terrifying you all. And it should. It especially is terrifying if you're really worried about, well, in this world of change, like, where do I stand? My message here is, it's less about where you stand, because I guarantee you, no matter where it is, pretty much everyone in this room is going to have that moment when the rug is pulled out from under their feet. It's more about who you are than where you stand. And let me explain. When the rug gets pulled out from your feet, things can go bad, fast. So I recently read an article that was making the rounds about the former CEO of United Way. I don't know if anyone else read this article, but basically she lost her job as CEO and completely fell apart, like by her own admission, right? She was depressed, she didn't know what she was going to do with her life because being the CEO of United Way had encapsulated her life, right? And I don't want to pick on her, this happens to many people. As an historian, the thing I focus on is what happens to people when their central identification is taken away. And the short answer is bad things, right? Some of them adopt really extreme identities. One of the people I study, Seigneur, he was this rural conservative Catholic lawyer. He lost his job because of the revolution. Within 3 years, he was a communist revolutionary storming the Assemblée Nationale in France, right? That sort of thing. That is to say, one of the most important things you can do as you get older and build your sense of self is to not put all your eggs in one basket. So you want to build identities that are complex, that have multiple centers of strength and identification. Because that helps provide a sort of ballast when things go wrong. Like if my job falls apart, I can do something else. What does that mean? There's a lot of other ways to identify yourself. Family, hobbies. I mean, hobbies are really important. Like being a super big sports fan is actually psychologically amazingly healthy. Because while many things can fall apart, like your sports fandom, it's just kind of always there, unless you're like an Everton fan and you're just wallowing in sorrow forever. But like for most people, like things will perk up at some point. But any sort of hobby, religious identifications, friends, place. There's a lot of different ways one can define themselves besides what they do, and all of these things are useful. So then the question becomes, great, how do I do that? Right? How do I build an identity that is resilient and complex? All right. And there is, I think, a clear answer to this. Now, when you're young and your identity first starts off, it's largely imitation. Right? You're imitating your parents, you're imitating your peers, and you don't put a lot of thought into it. But for those of you out there who are in high school, you are now in the moment, and this will continue, well, for some of you forever, but most of you into your 20s, where you are actively trying out different self-concepts, different ways of being, different identities, right? And as you do so, here's some advice for how to do it effectively, right? If you want an identity, here's how to do it. We used to think the way people formed identity was what's called the looking glass self, which we would look at the people around us, see what they thought of us, and that's how we would form our identity. But more recent psychological studies have shown this is false, largely because most of us have no idea what the people around us actually think of us. We're really bad at judging them. So what is actually true is that we form our sense of self based on how we think other people think of us. Now that has a very important implication, which has been proven through multiple studies to be true, which is this. You really only consolidate identity when you act it out in public. Because identity is based on what we think other people think of us. So we need the other people around. Even if we don't know what they actually think of us, even if we don't pay that much attention to them, we need them around to consolidate identity. So, if you want to be a good student, here's what you do, or think of yourself as a good student. You get the symbols of a good student, right? Like, I suggest a jacket like this. Maybe a nice bag, too. And then you do, in public, the things good students do, such as coming to school early, going to office hours, asking questions in class, studying in public. I recommend libraries, coffee shops, or any other public space. It's more effective to consolidate identity in public than alone. For those of you going to college, go to the library. Don't study in your dorm. This will make you feel like a good student. And the magic of identity is, it is self-reinforcing. Because people hate what is called identity dissonance. This is when something happens which contradicts your identity. So if you now think of yourself as a good student, you are going to do your darndest to live up to that identity, which will then, again, make you even think more you're a good student, and then you'll just be off and running. But this works with everything. If you want to think of yourself as a good friend, act out being a good friend in public. And social media is not really public. FYI, it's that actually being in public, right? Now, this has two benefits. If you think about, who do I want to be? And if you realize that some of the things that are less valued in life are actually equally important, like that hobby you have to your psychological well-being is in many ways just as important as your job. The friends you have, your family, for your psychological well-being are as important as your job. If you realize that and you actively go about reinforcing those identities, then you get two benefits. One, then you know who you are, so you can make choices that best reflect who you are and serve that. But two, when the rug gets pulled out from under you, when you lose your job, or when you lose a family member, or when you blow your ACL and you can't work out anymore, you have other identities to fall back on. So instead of falling apart, you shift what's important of your identity to them. And that is how you weather change. So, I can guarantee you that the world in 50 years will be slightly different from how anyone in this room here imagines it. And I can pretty much guarantee you that everyone here will at some point have that rug pulled out from under them and will be a big surprise. But if you take care of yourself, and if you consciously build a resilient identity, then you will be able to handle anything